The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Situations where you might be very outgoing, but you've learnt to not speak up so much in meetings because it annoys people. Doesn't necessarily mean you become more introverted. It just means that you've learned through experience that that's the way things are done. So anyway, it's interesting to think about that. But what we want to look at today is a bit of a framework to help you understand people and understand their motivations and perhaps be able to deal with them more effectively on that basis. So there's basically, we're up to module 5, and as you can see on your screen now, we have a situation where we are, we've covered feedback, and I'm hoping, of course, that you're continuing to do this work as we go through the series. We then looked at influencing capabilities, and you completed the online influencing profile, and that gives you some indication about how you like to influence other people. And what the whole profile was about was learning, of course, to alter your influencing style depending on who it was that you were dealing with and the situation that you're in. We looked at optimizing team performance, and essentially what we were looking at there was very much around conversations and the fact that conversations are so powerful and often underestimated as a motivational source. And we then looked at some of the motivational theories in Module 4 around ways and means of getting the very best out of people. And I suggested in Module 4 that that's actually our role, is to, as leaders, that is to try to do our very best to get the very best from the people we lead. So today we're going to look at personalities. But before I launch into that, I just want to reinforce the homework that I set you last time. And the suggestion was that you should try to use autonomy, mastery, and purpose in your leadership decisions and conversations. So most of you, of course, are dealing with what we call knowledge workers, and being educated often don't respond particularly well to the carrot and the stick or the reward and punishment approach that's so popularized in performance management. And the suggestion is that we should try to give people a sense of autonomy in how they do their work, that we allow them to develop both professionally and personally, and that we also give the why of work. We explain to people the reason that we want something to be done so that people are clear about the end game or the end objective. So I hope you've been conscious of that and you've tried to implement that as much as you possibly can. I guess I should check to see that I'm coming across loud and clear. Could somebody please type into the question box just the word clear to let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Otherwise, again, I'll be talking to myself for an hour, which isn't particularly amusing. Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Tom. Right. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Bill. Okay. Obviously, I'm coming across loud and clear. All right. So let's, the objective today, and I've sort of alluded to this, is to provide you with a fun and practical tool for understanding yourself and others. And part of that, of course, was to complete the personality profile. And one day that will come online, as is the case with the influencing capabilities profile. But at this stage, of course, you had a paper and pencil version I sent you. And if you have completed it, then this will be a debrief on that. And if you haven't completed it, then at least you'll know what this is all about. So when we finish this webinar, I strongly suggest that you do complete that. These tools, of course, aren't foolproof because, of course, you're entering in the data and it's a self-perception which can occasionally be wrong. But if you're very interested in this sort of work, then you can get somebody that knows you particularly well to complete it for you. And of course, if it correlates with your own view of yourself, then that adds a degree of validity to the whole exercise. So let's get underway. So we're going to look at the concept of personality. We're going to understand the personality traits, and this work comes from Carl Jung's work in the last century. Carl Jung was the first one that came up with personality differentiators. He argued that we can look at some different types of personalities and be able to typecast, if you like, people along personality types. But of course, that was highly controversial, and to some degree it still is, to be able to generalize like that and say that somebody has a predisposition to certain traits because they happen to have a certain type of personality. But it does have a lot of face validity because people often look at this, and when you completed it and you looked at some of the descriptors, you probably noted that some of those things were very true about yourself. Not all of them, because none of you would have got a score of 40 in one column. Remember, there's 4 columns and there were 40 statements, 20 strengths and 20 weaknesses. And I think it's fair to say, I certainly haven't seen it before, where someone's got something like 0, 40, 0, 0 or 40, 0, 0, 0. So in other words, we are a mix of all 4 personality types, but generally there is probably a predisposition to one personality type. We'll look at some application about how you should deal with those different personalities, and I will finish up with the platinum rule, which is essentially, the platinum rule says treat people how they want to be treated. Of course, the golden rule is treat people how you want to be treated, but that in itself is not necessarily effective. So the platinum rule is about treating people how they want to be treated. So hopefully that will assist you in getting the very best out of the people that you lead. All right, and the personality profile that I'm using is an adaptation of many, many personality profiles that are out there. You've got MBTI, you've got DISC, 2 very well-known personality types, and many of the descriptors are difficult to sort of understand at first glance. You've got to read through them. So I'm using 4 animal types: owls, lambs, bulls, and peacocks. And so it's pretty easy when I mention a bull, you get an image in your own mind about how a bull might behave or how a peacock might behave. So I'm using this because it's an easier version than some of the obscure terms that are used in some of these profiles. So, but my general my general opinion is that these personality profiles are reasonably accurate. Okay, so let's have a look at the model and how it's set up, and just build that up as we go. And you might like to look at your profile if you've completed it at the same time, because I will make reference to it at different times. So essentially you've got the 4 animals, you've got the owl, the bull, the lamb, and the peacock. And across the top, I'll just put that in so that you can see it on your screen now. And you'll notice that you've got the concept of introversion and extroversion. Now, there's a lot of nonsense that's written about introversion and extroversion, a lot of misleading generalizations that people make. Essentially, all it means is this: introverts, when they want to recharge their batteries, will often go within. So in other words, if you've been around people all day and you're an introvert, there will be a tendency where you will quietly go away somewhere and read a book or watch some television. The last thing you want to do is interact with other people. On the other hand, extroverts are more likely to be recharged by being with other people and maybe bringing somebody up or having a conversation with people, a bit of a dialogue. So introverts and extroverts are on a continuum, and it's fair to say that we've got bits of both of that in all of us. And when you actually look at your scoring, if you look at your owl and your lamb score, which of course are more on the introvert side, and you look at your bull and your peacock score, which is on the extrovert side. Now, if you add up your owl and lamb scores, and if you add up your bull and peacock scores, you'll get two scores. And the score which is largest will illustrate whether or not you're predisposed to introversion or extroversion. So that's the first interesting thing about the survey. Now, you may not have needed the survey to actually have told you that, but what normally happens is that when we're under pressure, and let's face it, in our modern world we're often under pressure, we will tend to revert to type because we feel comfortable in that type. So if you're introverted, you're more likely to become more introverted under pressure, and if you're extroverted, you're more likely to become more extrovert under pressure. If your scores were reasonably even, it's likely that it just depends on the situation or the people that you're with as to whether you're more introvert or extrovert. So essentially, that's the first dimension. Now, the other dimension is the dimension of task and people. Now, what I mean by that is that normally when we're working in the workplace, there's tasks to be done. And of course, in a workplace, we're normally working with and through other people. So whether or not someone has a predisposition towards task and people can be easily worked out. If you look at your profile and you add up your owl and your bull scores, and you add up your lamb and peacock scores, you will be able to note whether you are more task focused or more people focused. Now, again, all of us are a mix of task and people, but if the scores are quite uneven, it probably tells you a little bit about your orientation. So obviously if you add up your owl and bull scores and that's significantly larger than your lamb and your peacock score, the task is the most critical element of your orientation. So you might say, well, once we get all the tasks done, then we can enjoy some social interaction. On the other hand, if your people score is higher than your task score, it's likely that you might say, well, it's important for me to get along with people before we work on the task. So, we have these predispositions. And again, under pressure, you will revert to type. And of course, both of those things are important, task and people. So one is not more important than the other because we've got tasks to do, but we've also got to work with other people. Equally, there's no advantage in being extrovert or introvert. It is just what you are. And in fact, it's interesting to note that 4 out of 10 CEOs in this country are more inclined to introversion than extroversion. Now, so it's a bit of a myth to suggest that extroverts are better leaders than introverts. That's not necessarily the case at all. And it would be wrong to assume that. So, neither of these things are advantages. It's just describing who you are. Now, if we populate the model, we end up with 4 animals or 4 personality types, which are described as 4 animals. So we've got owls, who are more introverted and task-focused. We've got bulls, who are more extroverted and task-focused. We've got lambs, who are more introverted and people-focused. And we've got peacocks, who are more people-focused and extrovert. So that's the model that we're going to work with, and um, people often say to me, can you change? And as I said at the outset of this particular presentation, you can to a certain extent, depending on the work you do, but probably, and this is only my view, although it's shared by many other people, that you will have a predisposition towards one of these four, and it's likely that those traits will be fairly obvious, not only to you, but interestingly enough, to other people. So in other words, if I went out and talked to some people that you were dealing with, it's highly likely that they would be able to categorize you reasonably easily, assuming, of course, that your scores aren't dead even. So, and therefore, interestingly enough, people will treat you accordingly. So, for example, if they know you like to have a chat, they'll do one of two things. They'll engage in chit chat with you, or they'll avoid you if they don't want to have any chit chat. If they know you're very much a bull, they will tend to be quite assertive with you, knowing that that's how you like to deal with situations. But on the other hand, some people might avoid you or be reasonably passive because they'll assume that that's what you want. And so we have all of these sorts of scenarios occurring in the workplace all the time. All right, so let's look a little bit deeper at this, and what I want to do now is actually look at the four personality types and give a little bit of an overview or a descriptor of those personality types. And just because you may not have a predisposition towards these personality types, it's very important for you to consider them, because the chances are you're probably working with people who have these traits. And if you don't have these traits, then it's likely, of course, that you'll be confused or may not quite understand where they're coming from many, many times. So the peacock, their primary motivation is being popular. Now, these are all ideals. We can't always be popular, and in fact, not everybody will like us. But the truth of the matter is, the peacock strives to be popular. That's their motivation. That's their motivation, if you like. So these are all ideals, as I said. Their characteristics in broad terms, of course, there are other characteristics in the profile descriptor there that you've got, are extrovert, so they will tend to be reasonably outgoing. They will be talkers, so often they will say things like, I'm just thinking aloud. And to an introvert, that can be quite puzzling, because an introvert is often thinking first and then talking later. And then, of course, the optimist. The peacock sees the glass is half full, not half empty. So that generally tells us a little bit about their characteristics. In terms of their strengths, they generally have an engaging or appealing personality, and often, interesting enough, the peacock is the one that could probably get away with more at work than any other personality type. People kind of dismiss it and say, oh, that's just so-and-so being who they are. So they will often have an amusing story or a joke, or sometimes it's hard for them to focus on the task at hand because they want to talk about the engagement in the process. They're usually quite creative and colourful, and how that manifests itself is through, bright clothes, a loud laugh. They often are quite creative and will often come up with interesting solutions that sometimes can be very useful if harnessed correctly. And they have lots of energy and enthusiasm. High energy level is a very strong characteristic of the peacock, and generally speaking, people find them most of the time quite inspiring. So they're fun to be around. I've got a good peacock friend who's fun to be around, and I mightn't necessarily want them to rescue me in a crisis, but I certainly enjoy having a lunch or a dinner with them because they've always got some entertaining anecdote to tell me. So they're usually quite engaging and fun to be around. A couple of famous people that you might recognise to have these traits. We've got, of course, Paris Hilton, who many years ago went to jail for tax evasion, I believe. And instead of just quietly going away and doing her time in jail, she decided to turn that into a publicity stunt and told the world that she was going to jail and kind of turned it to some sort of a marketing campaign. I don't know about you, but I would just tend to just quietly do my time and walk away, but not Paris Hilton. And of course, the great Scottish comedian Billy Connolly, who, of course, is most people would find hilarious, but there's no structure to his stories. And I can remember seeing him being interviewed many, many times, and the interview just went off on any tangent. And the interviewer actually ends up not saying too much because Billy Connolly just takes it wherever he feels he wants to take it. And what's interesting is he's probably not even sure where he wants to take it. It just goes in its own direction. So we recognise Billy Connolly as a peacock without any shadow of a doubt. Their motto, if you like, in life is any publicity is good publicity. So the old Mae West line, any publicity is good publicity. In fact, most Hollywood movie stars would fall into the category of the peacock. Not all, I might say. The ones that certainly are in the gossip columns every day have a tendency towards being a peacock, and in fact, they can get quite depressed when they're no longer spoken about in the publicity columns, and they don't care necessarily whether the information is accurate. They just want to be talked about because, of course, that's part of the trait. But interesting enough, some actors do fall into the other categories, and I'll mention a couple later. But they can often be perfectionists as well because they're really trying to improve their craft. But generally speaking, the movie star per se does follow the line of the peacock. So I'm sure you know people like that you work with, and maybe you're one yourself. I'm sure you recognise those traits in other people, if not yourself. So, what about the next one? I'm going in the order that when you look at the order across the bottom in your scoring, you'll notice that this is the order that I'm taking. So let's talk about the bull personality. Now, the primary motivation for the bull personality is being powerful. Now, we can't always be powerful, and we're not always in powerful positions. But the bull, the ideal for the bull is to always be put into positions where they're in control. In fact, the greatest fear that the bull actually has is not being in control. So, as an antidote to not being in control, the bull will often take control. Without being asked, they'll often gravitate to leadership positions because in that case, there's less likelihood that they'll be taken advantage of. The characteristics of the bull, like the peacock, they are generally outgoing. They are doers, and what normally is the case with the bull is they have several balls in the air at once. They're juggling many, many different balls, and then often the case that they're juggling too many things. The bull generally takes on too many tasks. As you might recall from the framework I showed you earlier, the bull is a doer. They're very task focused, and generally, like the peacock, the glass is half full, not half empty. So I'm sure you recognise those traits either in yourself or some of the other people or some of the people that you work with. So the great strengths of the bull is that they're born leaders. Now, by that, I don't mean that they make great leaders, and sometimes bulls are very happy at this point when they say, there you go, I knew I was a great leader. No, what I mean by that is that the bull of the four personalities is in fact the most comfortable in a leadership role. They have less anxiety about being in control and being in a leadership role. And that's what I mean by that. So they'll gravitate to leadership roles because they feel the most comfort of all the four personalities in a role of leadership. Doesn't necessarily mean they make great leaders. I've worked for some that I didn't find at all good leaders, but they will gravitate nevertheless to those roles. They're goal oriented, so they're very much focused on the end game, and they'll often say things like, the bottom line is, or what's the bottom line? They'll ask the question. They're not particularly interested in all the detail. They're very interested on the big picture, and they like to move as quickly as they can from from A to B. Quickest way, of course, is a straight line to the goal. So they get on with it, and they get very frustrated with people who perhaps don't share the same urgency that they have to achieve a result. So a couple of leaders that come to mind are Madonna, the great female musician who really has managed her career from start. It's not finished yet, of course, and she's managed her career and done things her own way. She's reinvented herself many times, and she is always striving. She's a high energy, not backward and coming forward. And of course, Hillary Clinton is another example. We fresh in our mind from the 2016 presidential election. She's very forthright, not necessarily interested so much in popularity, but certainly very interested in being in control and being powerful. So I'm sure we recognise traits in other people like that. So their motto in life is, I'm in control and I'm willing to lead. So bulls will, as I said, gravitate to those leadership roles. Okay, moving right along, the owl. Now, the owl is one of the most interesting and complex of the four personality types. Their primary motivation is being perfect. Now, again, it's an ideal. There is no such thing as perfection in the human, in the human behaviour. But the owl is always striving to be perfect, and sometimes they'll actually take too long to get things done because they're striving to get it absolutely right. So it's not unusual for owls to gravitate to professions and occupations where there's a tendency to consider that there's a kind of a right answer. So engineering comes to mind, accounting comes to mind, landscape gardening comes to mind. These are the sort of occupations where there's a tendency for owls to gravitate towards because there's less margin for error, and therefore the ideal of perfection is closer. Their characteristics are they tend to be introverts. So unlike the other two personalities I ran through, they will tend to very much live in their own mind. They are thinkers, and sometimes they will overanalyze things. And I remember talking to someone the other day in an executive coaching capacity who was a classic owl. And I said, how's your fortnight been? Because I hadn't met them for a fortnight, and I'll never forget it. She said to me, something strange happened to me yesterday. And I said, what? And she said, well, so-and-so said hello to me yesterday. And I paused and said, well, what's unusual about that? And she said, well, that person's never said hello to me before. I said, maybe they were just in a good mood that day. And she said to me, oh no, there's something going on. So there is a tendency to overthink, and owls are definitely prone to overthinking situations and people. They tend to be glass half full people, and they will tend to be very risk averse and actually very good at assessing risk. So they will often look at things and see things that the other three personalities won't actually see until, of course, the owl points it out to them if they feel comfortable expressing that, being an introvert. So their great strengths are they are very schedule oriented, so they love to stick to tasks. They normally do adhere to to-do lists. In fact, they like lists all up, and they've even got lists for lists. And they have very high standards of themselves. And in fact, interesting enough, the owl is the toughest taskmaster on themselves. They are their own worst critic. And so it's not just high standards of everybody else, but it's also, and this is misunderstood, high standards of themselves. And they're very orderly and organised, not necessarily neat and tidy, I might say, but very predisposed to having order and routine as part of their regime. Two people that come to mind, two people, one a sports person and one an artist. Roger Federer. Now, Roger Federer, still playing tennis, of course, and at a very high standard, I might say. But Roger Federer could be classified as a perfectionist. He works extremely hard on his game, and I remember seeing a YouTube video of him asking somebody to put a bottle on the top of their head, and they'd stand about 20 metres away, and Federer would, with a ball and a racket in his hand, would confidently serve and knock the bottle off the head of the person standing there. Of course, the person standing there was terrified, but so much of a perfectionist and so committed is he to practice that he is able to do something which is quite remarkable, and it's well worth looking that up if you get a chance. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, the great artist, and you could, Renaissance man in the truest sense of the word. You may recall at school, and I've got a little picture of it there. You may recall at school when you were learning history, that you probably noticed those great sketches of the human body that Leonardo da Vinci had produced, and the muscle structure and everything was absolutely perfect. But what Leonardo da Vinci actually did is he went to great extremes to understand how the muscle structure worked in the human body. He went to a graveyard, I understand, dug up a body and basically dissected it to try to understand and to observe how the muscular system actually worked. That's how obsessive he was. That's how much of a perfectionist he was, wanting to depict the perfect muscular structure. Absolute perfectionist. And if he was alive today and he was doing the profile, he would end up with, I would suggest, at least 20 points in the owl column. So their motivation in life is, how can I paint this perfect picture? So they're always striving to do the very, very best. And sometimes that can be enormously frustrating to other personalities, because they often think, well, good enough is near enough. But that's not the owl's motto. they need to get it absolutely right, and they'll often ask many, many questions to get to the bottom of what it is that they want to get to. Finally, the lamb. The lamb, their primary motivation is being peaceful. Now, of course, two people on a desert island, there's not always going to be peace. So it's obviously got to be an ideal, but they don't like rocking the boat. They will avoid conflict at all costs and do everything they can to placate and mediate situations. Their primary characteristics are introvert, like the owl. They're watchers. So in a meeting, for example, they'll wait for everybody to have had a say, and when they feel it's safe, they'll jump in and give their point of view. And again, like the owl, they're pessimists. The glass is half full. They don't naturally walk around with a huge smile on their dial. They will tend to be happy within, but they won't necessarily show it on their face. Their great strengths are that they're competent and steady, and you know, if you give a lamb a job, they will have a tendency to get it done, as long as it's reasonable within the parameters of what they can achieve. They'll often be very reliable, and the reason for that is that they obviously don't want to rock the boat by doing it wrong or getting on the wrong side of you. They're usually peaceful and agreeable, so they're non-threatening, and people often feel very comfortable in their surroundings, and they're very good at being able to see two sides of a story. So if there's a conflict in the workplace, they will have a tendency to sit on the fence and see both sides of the issue. And sometimes that's exactly where you want to be. So two personalities that come to mind, and I said before that movie stars in Hollywood come across as peacocks, but there are great actors such as Keanu Reeves and Kirsten Stewart who really do shirk the limelight. They're not interested in all the publicity. That really isn't why they're in acting. They see it as a necessary evil, and they'll do everything they can avoid to be on the front cover of a gossip magazine, or to have their picture taken by the paparazzi. Now, Keanu Reeves will often complain about being photographed in New York when he's out having a bite to eat. He really isn't interested in that, and all these two are really interested in doing is to play the role in the most perfect possible way, and they'll go to extremes to actually make sure that they depict the character as perfectly as they can. And their primary motivation in life is peace is the overriding consideration. So they'll do everything they can to make sure that they don't rock the boat in the workplace. So, folks, there's the four personalities. Now what I'd like to do is just spend a bit of time running through some of the different ways that you can deal with those personalities as a leader. We'll ignore this exercise. Let's look at the peacock to start with. Now, when you're dealing with a peacock, and I'm assuming that you're not a peacock, but when you're dealing with a peacock, here are some things that you should and shouldn't do. And why should you do this and why shouldn't you do this? Well, obviously it's about engaging, and it's about getting the best from the other person and relating to them. The first thing is to recognize that they do often have a challenge in following through. So keeping diaries, keeping a systematic way of tracking time is not necessarily their forte. Remember, they're very people focused, so they'll often get distracted and move on to other things. So you need to give them reminders, and don't get frustrated with them. Just give them reminders. They'll actually appreciate the reminders. because it keeps them on track. So unfortunately, you've got to keep them on track because sometimes they find it hard to keep themselves on track. So realize that also that often they will talk without thinking. Remember I said before that they will think aloud. So often that's what they do. When they speak up, they're thinking. So what that means, of course, is that they will say things that probably aren't things that they should say. In other words, they're prone to having foot in mouth. And they will say things and then, of course, it's the wrong thing to say. But the thing about the peacock that's admirable is they don't dwell on it for too long. They just move on to the next thing. So don't think too hard about why they said something, because they themselves probably even haven't really thought about it. Okay, so recognize that they generally have a short attention span and they like a lot of variety and flexibility. So they'll often jump from one thing to the next. So they thrive on variety and flexibility. They enjoy being interrupted during the day. And so if you're leading somebody in the team, recognize that that's what they like doing, is to have lots of things that are happening and lots of variety in their work. And if you can provide them with that, they'll be in their element. So by definition, of course, they won't be too interested in they won't be interested in paperwork. They won't be interested in routine type activities. Don't expect them to remember appointments and be on time. Again, you need to give them reminders, and they will appreciate that. And don't think for a minute that they'll be offended by that. They actually will appreciate that because they find it hard and challenging themselves to organise where they need to be and what they need to do. So be prepared to hear their stories because they've always got a story, and often it's quite entertaining and amusing. So be prepared to hear it, because often if you listen to it, they will have a tendency to listen to you. And isn't that what you want? Of course. So, what about the bull? Now, bull personalities are interesting in the sense that they can be often misunderstood. So let's have a think about how we can get the best out of the bull. So I think the first thing to recognise is that the bull enjoys leading. They're comfortable in a leadership role. So what will happen is that they'll often gravitate to leadership roles, as I said before. So if there's a vacuum in your team, in other words, let's say you're not a bull, maybe you're an owl or a lamb and you're a bit reluctant to jump forward and make decisions, what will happen is the bull will jump in and make the decision for you. Now, the misunderstanding that you may have is that the bull wants to take over. But if you actually sat down with the bull and you said, why are you jumping in and making a decision that I should be making as your team leader or your leader? They'll often say to you, well, somebody had to make the decision. Nothing was happening. So I felt it was my position or my responsibility to jump in and do something. So you see, it's quite an honourable thing that they're doing. They're not actually trying to take over. They're just simply trying to fill a vacuum. So you can misinterpret that, can't you, often? So they will actually appreciate you if you're very decisive and very clear and short, sharp, and to the point. If you do that, they will admire you because they see a mirror image of themselves. But having said that, it's important for you to be firm with the bull. Insist on two-way communication. Often what will happen is that they have a predisposition to taking over. So just recognize that, you might have to say to people, look, do you mind if I finish what I'm saying, because it's important. And they won't mind that, by the way. In fact, they'll respect that. That's the interesting thing. Or if they start encroaching on the territory of other people in the team, then a firm but gentle reminder to them that we'd agreed that that would be your responsibility and that would be somebody else's responsibility is in fact the right way to go. So, just being assertive with the bull is actually what they want and what they need. But often what happens when you're faced with a powerful bull is there's a tendency for you and me or whoever to take a step back. And of course, what the bull does is take a step forward and fill that gap that's been taken by you taking the step back. That's entirely the wrong thing to do, because the bull will not respect you for taking a backward step. They will appreciate it if you hold your ground and explain to them that this is my territory, because again, they see a mirror image of themselves, and that's a good thing. They're not out to hurt people. They don't wear their heart on their sleeve. They are not nasty people. They just don't believe in showing vulnerability in public. Why? Because by showing vulnerability in public, there will be a tendency that people may take advantage of them. So they probably aren't all that interested in chit-chat. Small talk's not their thing. They see it as a waste of time, and it doesn't mean that they're not friendly. It doesn't mean that they dislike you. It simply means that they're task-focused and they want to get on and achieve the task. Be firm with them, as I said before, and stick to the point. They will respect you a lot more for the fact that you do that. And I've alluded to this. Realize that they're not prone to outward displays of compassion. So it's unlikely to see a bull crying in public. It's unlikely for a bull to show great sympathy or empathy, because again, by doing so, leaves them, in their mind at least, open and vulnerable to be taken advantage of. But it doesn't mean that they're not caring people. This is the big misunderstanding about the bull. Yes, they are, as much as any of the other four personalities. It's just that they don't walk around demonstrating it. And finally, the owl. Now, the owl personality is another very interesting personality. When you're dealing with an owl, of all four personalities, they are the most likely to be hurt. Because remember, they read a lot into situations. And because they read a lot into situations, there will be a tendency that they'll read too much. And they will overthink things, and they will believe that people may be out to get them. So they do get hurt, so be very careful how you phrase things. Be very careful when you give them constructive feedback, because they're striving all the time for perfection, and they will be very hurt if they believe that you're having a go at their workmanship. Realise that they're programmed with a mindset that likes to assess risks, so they will have a tendency to come to a meeting or say to you in the corridor or point out something, and you might perceive that as being very negative. But all they're doing is pointing out something that may actually need to be considered, because remember, they'll overthink things. So they're not being negative for the sake of it. Often what they're doing is pointing out a pitfall in an argument, or pointing out some risk that might be prevalent and perhaps should be considered. So listen to what they have to say, because they've given it a lot of thought, far more than you might have given it thought. Be prepared to answer their questions. They don't like waffle. They certainly don't like triviality. They're very interested in the detail. So don't be surprised if you've got a new initiative in the workplace. The owl will be the one who will probably ask all the questions, either at the meeting or in the corridor. because they want their questions answered, because they want to know everything about everything. So they're sponges for information. So don't be frustrated when they're asking you a lot of questions. They're really genuinely wanting to know so that they can deliver the perfect result for you. So it's quite an honourable process that they go through. Try to keep a reasonable schedule. They don't appreciate you being sloppy with time. So if the meeting is scheduled for an hour, it's a good idea to make sure that you finish on the hour for all sorts of reasons, but the owl will be the one that will notice that more than any other personality. So it's important to be schedule oriented when you're dealing with an owl. And realize, of course, that when you're arguing the case, as you often have to as a leader, you need to back up your arguments and opinions and make sure that they're based on substance. And they will really respect that. And if you don't do that, they'll probably either think or ask you why. And you need to have a good answer for that. Otherwise, they won't respect where you're coming from. So giving them a lot of information is quite reasonable. And finally, when you're dealing with a lamb, recognize there's a need to be clear about the direction you're taking, and they need to know what the end result is so that they can work with you towards that end result. Help them to set targets, and people who are lambs need to feel that they're aiming for a target. They're not natural goal setters. They're not good at looking at the big picture. So they need you to demonstrate to them what the target is and what you're aiming to do. So don't be afraid. In fact, again, they'll appreciate you doing that. Don't always expect their outward signs of enthusiasm. Remember, they're introvert and they'll tend to keep their emotions in check because they don't want to become across as offensive or in any way threatening. So there's a tendency for them to bottle up their points of view. And one interesting insight about the lamb is that when you delegate a task to them, they may put it in the too hard basket. In other words, they don't do it. And I'm sure you've had cases where that's happened. Think about this. What's happening there is that that's their quiet way of protesting. What they're actually saying to you, without saying it, is, I don't want to do this. But of course, the bull would just say to you, I don't want to do this. Let's say it up front. But the lamb wouldn't do that because the lamb doesn't want to be in conflict with you. So there's a tendency for the lamb to just say nothing and just stubbornly put off the activity until such time as you confront them about it. So that's their way of maintaining some sense of control in the workplace. So look for mutual commitments. You might recall in Module 1 we talked about asking people for their commitment. And I think this is very relevant with the lamb. So it's very important for you to say, can I get your commitment on this? And if you get a nod or a grunt or a yes, then it's likely that they will commit to it because they don't want to let you down. So commitment works really well with a lamb. All right, so that brings us pretty much to the end. If you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. We've got a couple of minutes. Type them in and I'll do my best to answer those questions. Now, I did mention at the outset that we're really on about the golden rule. Now, the golden rule is simply this. Treat people how they want to be treated. So in other words, when you're dealing with an owl, give them all the facts. When you're dealing with a lamb, make sure that you build a good, non-threatening working relationship with them. When you're dealing with a peacock, make sure that you enjoy and laugh at their jokes. And when you're dealing with a bull, just make sure that you don't give them too much detail and you explain to them what the bottom line is, and they'll go off and put the pieces together to make it happen for you. And if you treat people how they want to be treated, guess what? you'll get much better results as such. So have a bit of fun with this. You've got a profile that obviously I've sent you and you've completed. There's no reason why you can't use that in your own workplace and have a bit of fun with it in a staff meeting, and give people an opportunity to have a look at those things, and look at themselves, and generally have a laugh about it. We've just got a question here from somebody, and it says, if you're giving a presentation, uh, which of the four personalities should you emphasize? Well, if you're giving a presentation to a large group, there's a good chance that there'll be owls, bulls, lambs, and peacocks in the presentation. And that being the case, you need to be all four. So you need to have the facts, because the owls will appreciate that. You need to tell a joke or an interesting anecdote or story, because the peacocks will relate to that. You need to let people know that they won't be put in difficult positions, and the lamb needs to know that. And the bull, you need to explain to them what the bottom line is, so that they can get how they're going to be able to use the information to their best advantage. So if you do that, you're likely to give a good presentation. Hopefully that works. It's a bit similar to the influencing capabilities we talked about in Module 2. Try to do all of those four things. So the larger the group, the more versatile you have to be in terms of the way you project in your presentation. Now, like all these things, you've got homework to do, and I would like you to have some fun with this afternoon, if it is lunchtime where you are, and hopefully it is, being lunch and learn. I would like you this afternoon to go out and approach people with an emphasis on personality type. So have a bit of fun with this. Observe the people in your lunchroom. Observe the people in the corridor. Think, where are they coming from in terms of personality, and how might I get the very best out of them? Have some fun. Try some things out. Send me an email. Let me know what happens, because it can be very interesting. Now, if you know somebody you work very closely with and you think, my goodness, I can't quite work out, are they owls, bulls, lambs, or peacocks? It's probably likely that they are, if they did the profile, that they're all four. When I say all four, their scores are very close, so it might be more difficult, but some people it'll be very obvious. And anyone that gets 20 points in one column, and if you got 20 points, that means that 50% of your personality falls within one of those four categories. So it'll be very obvious to other people what personality type you are. Anyway, have some fun with it, folks, and enjoy the exercise. And I will see you in a couple of weeks' time when we talk about running effective meetings. So until then, goodbye, and have some fun with the personality profiles. Thank you very much.